Welcome to Interviews with Innocence, a podcast about spirituality, consciousness, and exploring the wisdom our children bring into this world. I believe that our very young children are our greatest teachers. After all, they're the masters of living in the present moment, bubbling in unconditional love, enjoying the messiness of life, and curious about the universe in all its dimensions. The pure essence that young children exhibit lives within all of us. My hope is that these interviews will help us discover, embrace, and connect with the sacred core of childhood that resides within each of our hearts. I am your host, Marla Hughes. Today, I am so excited to have Dr. Joe Tafur back on the program. Joe has been an integrative medicine activist throughout his medical career while in medical school at UCSD and during his Family Medicine Residency at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Tafur has observed that modern medicine struggles with certain mental and psychosomatic health problems because it fails to address the emotional and spiritual dimensions of these illnesses. Under the guidance of master shamans, Dr. Tafur has learned about the importance of acknowledging the emotional body and its role in modern disease. Welcome back, Joe.
It's nice to be back. Thank you for having me, Marla.
Yes, you're very welcome. And if the listeners hear anyone in the background, that is his darling aunt who is chatting.
Yeah, it's probably
chatting away.
Louder.
So today I would love to, we've talked a little bit about ayahuasca and your journey. And today I want to talk some about your new talk, which is Spirituality Loves Science. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, spiritual healing loves science. Yeah.
Spiritual healing loves science. Yes. So let's begin talking a little bit about the science of plant medicine, and just not very long, but briefly about epigenetics, and just talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think we'll jump into that. Is that the work I do with plant medicine kind of informed, and one of the kind of theses of my book is that the epigenetics would be potentially a place where trauma imprints would be stored, where it's kind of a form of cellular memory. And so it's not just me, there's a lot of research and papers about epigenetics holding like the imprint of certain traumatic events that would linger there. And so around like the acute childhood or what are the adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma, the way that somebody could become imprinted in a what would be kind of a stable fashion. It would be stabilized.
Right.
And stay with them for a really long time. And then there's growing body of research showing even that ancestral trauma, it's speculative, but there's like Rachel Yehuda's work with the concentration camp survivors and their descendants, that those people are carrying this increased prevalence of anxiety among the children of concentration camp survivors is not necessarily from their parenting or environmental experience, but maybe a direct result of epigenetic imprinting from the concentration camp trauma that's being passed on.
Right. Joe, can you define epigenetics for those who don't know what that means?
So epigenetics basically refers to the science and the mechanisms around the way that the genetic code, the expression of the genes can be modulated. So that you have different, you have your genes, the hardwired blueprint of you, but then it turns out there's a huge amount of versatility in how those genes are expressed. So you have two twins that have the same DNA, and yet they have different, phenotypes, different physical aspects to themselves, and many other aspects, whether it's personality or other aspects of their physiology even would be different, even though they have the same DNA code, because their epigenetics is being affected differently by their personal lives.
Right.
What they eat, how they live, what they're exposed to, and as it turns out, emotional stressors and things like that.
Well, I know you found that emotions play a huge role in disease, and that trauma, past trauma, and I was really fascinated by the story about the girl that had the migraine. And
Yeah.
can you just tell that a little bit about that, please?
Sure. Yes, I talk about that in the book, and it's I call her Lisa in the book. It's a friend of mine that I still am in touch with, and continues to do well. And so then she was struggling with migraines, and that's one of the reasons she came down. And there was much more severe with her menstruation, and then so a lot of people suffer with migraines. Different things set them off, whether it is like a menstrual cycle, hormonal cycles, or also sensory input, light, certain flavor, certain smells, certain sounds, that push people into this kind of sensory overload, and they get into this some kind of maladaptive pattern. And so there's some research, that I had never come across previously, was never exposed to in my medical training, around the role of childhood trauma or childhood stress contributing to migraine headaches. As a doctor, we're just kind of taught that that's just a mysterious problem, has some genetic element, so there's this question around, okay, there's a genetic element, but then there's also this epigenetic element. There's the part that might be hardwired. You have these people who have these genetic vulnerabilities or tendencies, but then some people don't express them and other people do. So what is it around that? What leads to some genes being turned on or off or modulated in some way that would lead to this problem versus them not having a problem? This idea is that migraine headache, I had, with being up there at the center for a while and exposed to a lot of different people, I had kind of gotten the feel for that some of these people, not all, but some of the migraine headache cases have been through a lot of sensory overload in their childhoods, through like a lot of aggression and screaming and rage that they've been exposed to. And I'm not saying that's always the case at all, but in the cases that people that were coming, where I spent a lot more time with them in a retreat center than I would have as a doctor, I kept getting that kind of feedback. And so I asked her, is that the case for you? And it was the case for her. Her dad was a really kind of a rageful person that was very loving at some times, but at other times was very, very aggressive, and kind of person that would, throw the dinner off the table and, flip things over. And so she had that history. And so then I also started, afterwards I did research into this, the maladaptive stress response, that there was research around that this concept. And that's what I was bringing up, is that before, as a doctor, I'd never really been exposed to that thinking, that somehow migraine headaches would be aggravated by a childhood trauma, or that would be something to focus on in their treatment. And so in her case, we decided to go at it with the traditional treatment that we offered at the center, which is traditional plant medicine, and the diet, the strict diet with the Shipibo traditional diet, and then eventually ayahuasca ceremony. In her ayahuasca ceremonies, it turned out to be completely about her father and purging out and letting go and forgiving him and learning about developing compassion for him, for all that he had been through in his own life, and why did he act like that, and how was he, and then also accepting him as he is, that he may never change, and she needed to address that. So she went through this deep spiritual process around that in these ceremonies, this deep emotional healing process, and that led to this tremendous shift in her symptoms that continues to lead to what looks like at least years of at this stage looks permanent, and I guess you could say from really severe migraine headaches.
Right.
And in that process, I had, in my visionary state, I was informed by the ayahuasca, or that was my experience while I was working on her and working with her, that I was informed that this is an epigenetic problem in her case, literally, like using those terms, that it wasn't in her genes, it was on her genes, right, the problem. And that was the focus. It wasn't something she's, it's not a genetic destiny, as, people kind of say, oh, well, your parents had this, or you're going to have this, right, that kind of thinking. And it's like, actually, this may be as I talk about in the book, would be a software problem, not a hardware problem. And so is it possible to shift that software? And the evidence is her decrease in symptoms. So the answer is yes, in her case.
Yes. And I know you said that, I think it was yourself or someone in the kind of visionary state seeing black in her actual genes, that, the bad stuff, you actually saw that.
Yeah. What I saw was, like, I was looking at this, what would look like this, what we call it the chromatin, the DNA wrapped around the storage protein molecules that it's wrapped around and packaged in.
Right.
So then that is what forms the chromatin that, like, can be congealed into the chromosomes or stored in different forms within the cell. And so then that has, and it's molecular kind of the way we understand it and see it, like these balls, these beads, packaged together, and that has all these nooks and crannies in between all the surface of that. And I saw a little black dragon swimming through the cracks and crevices of that over the top of the genes. And that's when I received the message that it was the story of the trauma, the energy of that swimming over the genes. Mm-hmm. That was the root of her problem.
Joe, when she came to you, did she even consider it might be something in her childhood, or was it just like, I'm having these headaches, can you help?
Yeah, I don't know that she had really connected the dots. I mean, she knew that stress made it worse. I think a lot of migraine people understand that stress makes it worse, but I don't think that they would necessarily, she didn't connect it to a particular stress that may have set it off, that may have started her on that path. Said, oh yeah, well, maybe I just get headaches when my dad yells.
Right.
But it's not like I get headaches because my dad yells.
Right.
That was the difference.
And I know the forgiveness part is a huge, huge part of that too, seeing it and then forgiving. And isn't it true that many times people see things that they don't even remember, that they didn't even know about?
That happens all the time. And so there is a little bit of room there for when you have to kind of, maybe some things need to be verified. So it's very common for repressed memories to be brought up, or sometimes people have the memory, but they don't have any associated feeling. Like feelings around those memories have been shut down.
Right.
And so they re-experience, it gets reopened. There's sensory input around that particular memory, or the emotional memory around that experience gets reopened. It was previously shut down and frozen. And then all of a sudden, because of the psychedelics, it appears that one of the ways that would happen is through this, there's a default mode network, is one of the neural networks that has been identified in the brain that is involved in a lot of your autobiographical story of yourself and how you kind of filter life, how you filter the world outside you, how you filter what you feel inside. Mm-hmm. And then it actually has been described as almost like the neural correlate of the ego, like your sense of yourself. And then sometimes, whether it's ayahuasca or some other psychedelic treatments, that dissolves,
Right.
They lose that sense of themselves. But what ends up happening is it kind of reopens gates that have previously been shut down. So then once you open those gates, sometimes what's stored within the being, within their body, within other aspects of themselves, all of a sudden they get a flood of emotional memories.
And then where does so they get this flood of emotional memories, and the healing.
The healing happens in first is in the properly supported scenario.
Yes.
In which now they can complete. That's like, you're going to talk to Martina soon, and somatic experience therapy is a big model for how this kind of trauma healing happens. The idea is that there's a frozen trauma that has not completed it's processed,
Right.
interrupted. And so then it has to be completed.
Yes.
But there needs to be the right kind of support and safety in order for that level of vulnerability to be, let's say, grieved
Right.
or released. The catharsis, that maybe it just happens little bits at a time, but there's a de-escalation that needs to happen. And so that's why that's what somatic experience therapy is all about. And like I said, Martine's going to explain it more, but there's a big overlap with shamanism, according to the theories that they put forth, were based on this idea of the biology of frozen trauma, where an antelope, gets attacked by a tiger. And then when they think they're going to die, and when it's too late for them, they just freeze. Then they need to shake that off. That they literally shake that energy off. And somehow they're able to de-escalate from that kind of locked up fear response and get back to a baseline. And so there's some kind of emotional biology around trauma and fear response, that there needs to be a de-escalation.
Right.
And so there's something, it's more complicated than that, I'm sure, but there's just ways of talking about it, that there's some catharsis and some release that needs to happen so that you can move forward in the process. It's kind of like, one way to think about it for me in the scientific perspective is this chronic inflammation. You have a wound, let's say. I studied for a little while. I studied delayed wound healing. So let's say you have like a diabetic wound or some other like wound problem where it's not healing, or even a chronic joint problem, inflammation. And then somehow you get into this like chronic inflammation, where inflammation was supposed to be part of the healing process.
Right.
You injure yourself, then there's the swelling, there's the redness, there's the pain, there's the heat. That's the classic inflammatory response. And that's supposed to lead somewhere. When you have a wound cut open on your skin, then there's an inflammatory process that goes on there. And then that can turn into a chronic inflammatory process and not progress to what is the healing. So in other words, you're stuck in the beginning of the response, and it hasn't gone to the wound, a little bit of scarring, a little remodeling. That's what goes on in the wounds. And so you need to guide the person through the completion of the healing process. And the initial response was, okay, this is how you respond in the acute phase. And then you get stuck in that acute phase response. So the person has this frozen trauma. They're reacting to a helicopter flying overhead 30 years after Vietnam, as if it was Vietnam.
Yes. Yes.
Frozen trauma. So it's like this is a very real phenomenon that people get stuck. They get triggered, So that's something that happens. Once people go through a big healing process, they find themselves less triggered.
Mm-hmm.
When they have a difficult relationship with their mom, I've had a few people come through the treatment in Peru where they leave, they weren't sure what really happened, did something happen or not. And then they get home, they go, I could talk to my mom on the phone. I just did not even react.
Yeah.
So there's a physiology around that.
Right.
The way you are triggered, the way your actual body, emotional physiology is triggered by what's going on. And so then there's the frozen stuff that's trapped from the past that is there in a way to protect you. So there's a lot of reason to have adaptive stress response, where you'd actually, if it's a lion or something that's really dangerous for you, yes, you do want to freak out when you see that. But there's other things, other traumas that don't really lead to any adaptive response. Being abused as a child doesn't really go anywhere.
Right.
It just accumulates and it stays in there. And then you have to de-escalate that. You have to help process that through. You have to help resolve that, take that beyond just the initial frozen response. That might end up being just a general distrust for other human beings that doesn't serve that person. So it's a little complex, but it's a little. I think it is possible to understand and relate to.
Absolutely.
And so it seems that the epigenetics are an area we're still learning a lot about. It's still speculative, But there is reason to believe that, yeah, that would be part of where this kind of memory happens.
Mm-hmm. Well, I realize as I listen to you talk and also listen to your other lectures that kind of the proof is in the pudding. You see these people come through that have been gone through all kinds of traditional Western therapy and pharmaceutical drugs, and nothing has worked. You talk about the Vietnam War vet, I know, in your book, and nothing works. And then they do come and do plant medicine, and it seems that those genes, or that blackness in the genes or the epigenetics, it softens, and you see a lot of healing. So that certainly speaks for itself.
Exactly. So then the latest version of that, and then to follow, because then I got into that, and then with epigenetics and with ayahuasca was kind of revealing to me. But so then we thought, oh, let's do research with that. Let's do epigenetics, with ayahuasca treatment. But it was difficult to coordinate. And then meanwhile, while we're considering that, the MAPS trial is running with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant PTSD. So they already have like all the, the variables controlled as much as they can, and they've screened the people, and they're tracking them through this psychotherapy course that includes 3 sessions with MDMA,
Mm-hmm.
which are run under a protocol. There's kind of advanced techniques that they've developed. And so they're doing that for people with treatment-resistant PTSD, and their gathering is something like 18 years. So somebody's had 18 years of stable PTSD that's not getting better, it's not responding to medication. 1 year out, they say 67% of them no longer have PTSD. So that is a revolution in psychiatry.
Yes.
Like the proof is in the pudding. It's like game over.
Right.
So where PTSD, where we know that there is studies and evidence to indicate that these people do have epigenetic imprints around certain gene regions that are related to their prior trauma, that are correlated to their PTSD severity. So there's reason to believe that they're showing that kind of a dramatic response from 18 years of struggling with the problem to not even having the problem a year later,
Right.
that something's shifting in their biology.
Yes.
And so that's what we're trying. That's the Modern Spirit Epigenetics Project.
I love it when you say science is not medicine. It is important, but it is not medicine. Medicine heals, even spiritual medicine, and science should not limit healing work. So let's segue into the spiritual healing, love science, and about bridging the two worlds. Can you talk a little bit about the importance, once again, we talked about this before, but the ceremony, the importance of the song, the Icaros, and you just talking about love. What is love, and how this all plays into this healing process?
Well, I think like the segue for me is looking at this MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trial, and even the psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy research, or even the Johns Hopkins stuff, where they got these mystical experiences and all that. So then they, you can kind of like paint around the perimeter and say, oh yeah, the study shows this, and the people, like the proof is in the pudding. They had these major shifts, no doubt about it. It meets all the standards. But then the big question is, well, what happened during those sessions?
Right.
And what's going on there? And in the case of the MDMA psychotherapy trial, I went to the training and I met some of the trainers and the therapists, and I watched the videos. And these people are extremely graceful human beings that need to really, like one of the lead trainers talked about, well, you can only take someone as far as you're ready to go. And so what does that mean? And that's very much along the lines of the traditional like shamanic training in the Amazon, where to really learn how to work with people in those kind of states is to determine your ability to do that is determined by how far you've gone in your own personal healing process. How far are you willing to go into facing your own fears and traumas and insecurities and pain is actually what's going to determine your ability to hold space for someone else in such a state. And so that involves a lot of personal self-inquiry, self-discipline, self-development, and what would be considered, I think, in many traditions, spiritual practice.
Right.
So it would involve the raising of your consciousness. At the very least, we could say that much. And so that is actually that's kind of the unspoken truth about that study, is the people that are holding space in that study are doing it with kind of what I would call like a maximal love consciousness.
I love that.
There's no question that that's true. What if somebody will call it to me the other day, had something, they made a phrase about profound, how do we talk about it? Profound openness. Profound openness that goes beyond our understanding of such a concept that I just said out loud, goes beyond anything that we understand about neuroscience or molecules. It's a lived experience. And so if we just stay within what we can describe, and which is also very arbitrary, it's based on a lot of assumptions scientifically, and there's mysteries underlying every aspect of it, from the quantum physics of the molecules, that are beneath it all, to just all the other questions that we have unanswered about our what it is to be alive. So we have to be able to open up that step. So that was the point of that spiritual healing love science. I was like, the problem is that if we limit the discussion to just the physiology and what has been culturally acceptable around psychology, which is a gigantic mystery, how your thoughts even exist at all, and yet they talk about it like it's just, run of the mill,
right.
Like it's no big deal, which is it's basically on the same leap of faith level of, any number of far out there religious beliefs. And so as far as just accepting, well, that's how we think, that's how it is. And that's, yeah, okay, but we don't know what that is. So to say that we know what it is a lie, and just kind of inappropriate. Mm-hmm. So there's a gigantic mystery holding the whole thing the entire time. And so if we just limit it to this discussion, we go, we don't really know enough about how emotions affect people. We don't really know enough about how stress affects people for us to make that, comment, or to tag that into this study or this research, or the way this profound contact with a universal love experience, the way that would influence someone. I don't know if we're ready to talk about that. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum that I present, this, where spiritual healing, is allowed and celebrated, that's where people are actually getting better.
Right, exactly.
And so that's where the medicine is the science is a study, and it's very beautiful and it's important, and it's a wonderful exploration and celebration. But sometimes it's just not enough. And sometimes, if we were being honest and you're really worried about someone that you love and you want them to get better, you're going to open your paradigm as soon as you find out that paradigm needs to open in order for them to get better.
Absolutely.
You're going to throw that out, like yesterday's newspaper. Spiritual healing process is the same as a spiritual practice.
Right.
The things that people do to raise their consciousness, the things they do, this emotional connection we have to spirit, to feeling, to energy, to feeling you're somehow connected. There's something there for you, a resource, beyond the material that you are in some kind of interaction with. And that involves a certain sensitivity to experience that, to be aware of that. And that trauma blunts that sensitivity. And when you have a society where trauma is not dealt with at any serious emotional or spiritual level, at any large scale, then you can have a very blunted sensitivity to the kinds of things that actually are the true like source of moral guidance and ethics, is actually like self-love.
Right.
So then you have this overly scientifically driven, let's say, medical academic world that would appear very insensitive at times.
Yes.
Like, I think that's a pretty fair statement.
Yes.
And then but then we're beginning to realize that insensitivity is not just because, as I mentioned, that somehow they're smarter or they figured it out and everyone else can't figure it out, and that that's the way it should be, that the logic and the reason guides us there. It's actually trauma. It's actually unresolved trauma that's not allowing them. They haven't had the safe space for them to get vulnerable and de-escalate, to open their sensitivity up.
That's so true. And and then you bring in, thank goodness there are so many doctors now in Western medicine that are having near-death experiences and having all of these, and they're coming out and also using these terms such as universal love and raising vibration and consciousness. So I do really feel like that there is an awakening happening, and we have to think about our future generations. I mean, by holding this trauma, and I mean, by healing ourselves, as you say, it helps heal the future, our children, our future generations. And it is so true that I think people can be somewhat, I hate to say closed-minded, I don't mean judgmental, until a loved one needs help or something happens to a loved one. And like you said, then the whole paradigm changes. And that's really important. So let's talk about this we don't have very much more time, but this universal love, this universal consciousness. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about that and the mystical experience or the visions that people see, because it seems it doesn't seem, I've experienced this, that you really do raise your vibration or consciousness, that you do experience other dimensions or other just a higher frequency. So can you just speak on that a little bit?
First, you have like your emotional existence, your subjective experience of life.
Yes.
That you share with other humans, and you have, you can tell when somebody's staring at you on the freeway at 80 miles an hour. That's a totally normal reality that doesn't really fit into the current paradigm, And so there's people that try to explain things like that, like Rupert Sheldrake's into that. He has a whole book called The Sense of Being Stared At. And he talks about, he opens it up with, it's all about animal relationships, people with their pets,
yes,
having all kinds of experiences. And he tracks, instead of having any kind of proof of mechanism, he just lists like thousands of anecdotes, like thousands. So that's the beauty of right now, is that with the internet, a lot of times they're going to that, like around this, that instead of just trying to prove some mechanism and have all the variables controlled, well, what if you can show that like 100,000 people are all saying the same thing? It's like, well, something's going on.
Yes.
And so there's that, and then you have your dreams. So then you got everyone's talking about, so you talk about the near-death experience, and Eben Alexander and Proof of
yes.
Heaven. That's such a cool book, I thought. It's such an interesting experience from, such a highly respected person. And this, you could have these people with this kind of nihilistic perspective. They'll say to, oh yeah, when you die and you see the tunnel and the light,
right.
It's just a computer. It's just the computer shutting down. Like, that's all it is. And then you have even Alexander says, well, this is what happened to me when they said my
Right.
brain wasn't even working. And both, that's it. You just taking them both at their word. You know, the person telling me the computer shut down, their argument is very flimsy. It's just as flimsy as his, where he tells me that he saw that there's this universal love in this higher dimension that's superseding the light and dark realms that are in this plane of existence in which we exist, that are there for us in order for our free will, to allow us to make mistakes and learn things the hard way.
Right.
And then that's part of this loving trajectory that ultimately, you know, after death is understandable. The tragedy and the, you know, the terror and all those things, and the way that sometimes we have, you know, that's a very delicate topic, you know, because some people are suffering so intensely. So it's, how do you even comment about that? It's not really our place to say, but then all of us have experiences within our own life where some difficult lesson ended up opening us to something that was more beautiful, that we kind of, you know, we kind of shift from regretting something to kind of learning to try to appreciate the blessing of it.
Yes, yes.
And so that's something along those lines. And so there is higher dimensions, you know, there's, well, the quantum physics and the mathematics around that is guiding so much of our technology according to their models. There's like at least 10 dimensions beyond what we've understood.
Yes.
You know,
and astrology. I love
the
study of astrology. And I think the important thing also, or I know, is that I've talked to so many people that have had near-death experiences and shared death experiences, which really finally convinced Raymond Moody. He now says, I give up, you know, there is an afterlife, but that people who experience this, their whole world changes. They change their lives. And there's something to be said for that. It's just not this dream sort of thing that happens and you go right back to it. It really changes lives. So I think that speaks loudly also.
Well, and that's part of it, is that what is the truth about a significant experience in your life? I mean, those are the things that change your life.
Right.
What is the reality of what the thing is? Usually it has to do with like how it feels.
Exactly.
You know, is probably the most, when something, you feel it really strong in your body and your being, and that's when you go, this is really significant. Whoa.
Yeah.
You know,
and
it's not the idea, and that's mostly how we're motivated.
Right. So true.
You know, and so the other part is us trying to be reasonable and careful. Is like, oh, what if my feelings are kind of miscalibrated by some kind of traumatic experience? You know, that's this part of this whole emotional biology thing, and that's about all clearing ourselves up and clearing up our sensitivity, so that we can try to acknowledge and recognize, okay, this is actually significant for me. This is it feels strong and it's healthy.
Right.
You know, versus like we have the other kind of situation where, let's say, an abused woman, where they say, like, because of the disturbance in the wiring from abuse and things like that, that it's more painful for them to leave the relationship than to stay in the relationship. So it's actually their feeling that guides them to stay.
Yeah.
You know, all the reason is saying, get out.
Right.
But then, so there's a healing that has to happen for somebody to be able to appreciate a different.
Right. And I love it when you talk about using the intergenerational wisdom, and that's exactly what we're talking about, you know, using ceremony, ritual, maybe ayahuasca, song. The song is so important. Well, listen, we need to wrap it up, but could you share at the end of your book or at the end of your talk, you shared a quote by Rinpoche and Freud. Do you?
Freud,
yeah. Do you? Could
I got
you share
a copy
those?
of my book on the. I'm trying to find my. my book on the computer because
Yeah.
I don't have I'm in Colombia trying to push the Spanish book.
Okay.
But I do have. Let me forgive me. I'll have it in just a second. I should have a
Okay.
copy of it.
Okay.
Basically the first quote was about was from Sigmund Freud. Is him talking about his friend that's got this. His friend is a religious person, and this friend of his always talks about. Here we go. I think I got it. He says, Sigmund Freud, from the book Civilization and Its Tenets. Sigmund says, I had sent him, an unnamed friend, my small book called Future of Illusion that treats religion as an illusion, and he answered that he entirely agreed with my judgment upon religion, but that he was sorry I had not properly appreciated the true source of religious sentiments. This, he says, consists in a peculiar feeling, which he himself met without, which he finds confirmed by many others, and which he may suppose is present in millions of people. It is a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of, quote, eternity, a feeling of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, quote, oceanic. This feeling, he adds, is a purely subjective fact, not an article of faith. And then Sogyal Rinpoche from the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying says, in the path beyond the ordinary mind, all the great wisdom traditions have told us is through the heart.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So that's just it. I mean, back to just to finish up, is just the multidimensional consciousness, allowing the heart, the emotional, the spiritual dimensions of consciousness is, there seems very evident that all the sustainable cultures that we have been in contact with, they maintain awareness of that.
Right.
Those people who have been able to live in a sustainable relationship with their ecosystems, they maintain that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we know from the wisdom.
Yes. Yes.
Without that, it's not clear that you could live sustainably in this realm.
Right. Right. Well, Joe, thank you so much. I really appreciate. And could you just mention one more time how people can find you if they'd like to hear and learn more? And we will have
Sure.
your book, Fellowship of the River. We'll have all this in the show notes.
Sure. Well, no, just the link to the study to modernspirit.org will link you to the crowdfund for the Modern Spirit Epigenetics project. So we're still raising money, looking for money to complete. We've had enough money to collect the saliva, and we have enough money to run a number of samples, but we want to raise more money so we can run more samples and have more data.
Right.
And like we're saying, trying to show where spiritual and emotional healing touch the flesh is what we're talking about,
Yes.
really. And that's this epigenetic study in the PTSD healing that we just discussed. So that's all there on modernspirit.org, and get the link to the crowdfund. And then I also have drjoetafur.com,
Yes.
which is just some information about me in the book, and eventually we'll be more active to talk about events and things like that.
Okay.
Taking people to Peru, etc.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, and you have a great day in Colombia with your family.
Exactly.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very, very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening in today. If you want to learn more about the show, you can find us at interviewswithinnocence.com and on Facebook or Instagram at Interviews with Innocence. Please write me a message, tell me what you liked, and let me know what else you would like to hear. I would love to hear from you. And if you liked what you heard, please leave us an iTunes rating and review. It helps other listeners find the show. Thank you.